So I am Lorraine Dolan from Sage. We're a support and advocacy service, and I am the coordinator for the Midwest, so covering Limerick, Clare and North Tipperary. Siobhan invited ourselves to present today based on coming from the perspective of abuse and age, so domestic abuse and age, and what we find presented to us, I suppose, in my role every day and through referrals. We are a referral-based service. We're wholly inclusive of majorities and minorities in a manner of speaking. Referrals can be made by the person themselves, by family members, community services, GPs, public health nurses, you name it, really, we're open to referrals from everyone. So it would be pointless of me listing them all. We work collaboratively with other services, but we very much remain independent in that it is our role to advocate for the person in question, the person who has been referred. So the client's at the centre, and we advocate on their behalf and for in line with what their needs and their wishes are. As we often put it, we collaborate where necessary. We collaborate where possible and challenge where necessary. I know Gillian mentioned as well, she was talking about nothing about us without us. And our tagline is, I think they robbed it from us actually, our tagline is nothing about you without you. So that was one similarity there, Gillian. Our mission then is, our target group, is over 65s and vulnerable adults, and including those with an intellectual disability. But again, as I say, in terms of client group, it's just wholly inclusive, there's no discrimination to any cohort. Our mission statement then is to promote, protect and defend the rights and dignity of vulnerable adults and older people. And our goal ultimately is to ensure that the older person and vulnerable adult, our client, has their voice heard, and as far as is possible that their will and preference is upheld. So the what and the who, and I suppose even if we speak a bit from the how, really, Sage Advocacy, it's a service that empowers individuals by taking action to help people say what they want, secure their rights, represent their interests, or obtain the services they need. Our clients are people who are vulnerable as a result of, sorry, half of my screen is missing because of the cameras at the side. So 2 secs. If I can move that. 2 secs. So I can't read the slides. 2 secs now.
You can pull your
I can
down on the bottom.
Or pull it down there. Yeah, is that okay? So our clients are people who are vulnerable as a result of reduced decision-making capacity, disability, mental health difficulties, or frailty in line with the aging process. Many are also, we feel, at greater risk because of their living environment. And Gillian kind of crossed over this as well. People living in a residential care facility or in their own home where they're dependent on others for care and support in relation to daily living. And I'll go into that a bit more as well further on. So I suppose relevant to today's session is obviously the Domestic Violence Act 2018. This act, as you all know, defines domestic abuse as the physical, sexual, financial, emotional or psychological abuse of one person against another who is a family member or who has been an intimate partner, regardless of their gender or sexuality. Unfortunately, from our experiences, and in law, this does not cater for the multiple situations and relationships where a vulnerable adult can be potentially abused. For example, where coercive control is being exercised by people other than close family members. Domestic abuse is multifaceted and extends to a wide range of individuals and living environments, in care facilities, in people's own homes, and in community settings. The Domestic Violence Act 2018 does not either cover coercive control by adult children over a vulnerable parent, nor abuse in residential care settings, both of which Sage advocates are presented with regularly. And I continue to talk about that more, whereby, that relationship between the person who requires care and the caregiver, none of that is currently covered in the domestic violence legislation. It leaves people open. The power and control element of domestic abuse presents itself frequently within Sage referrals. Situations, for example, where an older person wishes or wants to remain at home, but unfortunately are depending on somebody to care for them to be able to maintain them at home, be it a family member or HSE care, even to provide care so that they can stay at home. A dynamic which is often exploited, we feel, whereby a vulnerable person is told that if they don't act or behave or comply in a certain way, that they'll be put into a nursing home. And unfortunately, it's also been voiced to Sage that the caregiver sometimes behaves in this manner because of carer burnout or because there's not adequate home care supports to supplement their caregiving. that's not always the case for abuse to happen, but it has been voiced that sometimes it is the case. This power and control dynamic is also evident in long-term care facilities, again, whereby the resident is dependent on a nursing home, for example, for care, and it leaves those vulnerable wide open to abuse. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but it was the root of how SAGE was set up initially was the exposing of the scandals such as Leas Cross, Ars Attracta, and then even most recently the Brandon case. Is that all okay so far? Yeah. So in terms of it today, again, the focus of my being here is coming from the perspective of abuse and age. And in our experience, in SAGE experience, the older person who's reliant on others for care and support are likely to experience abuse to a greater extent than those who are not reliant on others. This type of abuse can come in many forms: financial abuse, emotional abuse, or coercive control. Abuse regularly occurs in situations where there is an unequal power relationship and people are afraid to challenge or confront the perpetrator or involve outside agencies such as HSE or safeguarding. This could be, again, in somebody's own home, whereby, say, an older person is receiving, we'll say, care from, just for example, a HSE or an agency, or it could be in a long-term care facility. And I suppose it's important here, some of the key findings from the 2020 National Safeguarding Report. There was a pattern of age profile. The pattern of age profile for concern notifications was 66% for those under 65, but it was 34% for persons over 65, which, okay, it's a smaller number, but it's still an alarming statistic, really. The total number of notifications for persons over age 65 in 2020 was 3,412, and it was 3,337 in 2019. So there is a steady increase. For persons aged under 65, the most significant category of alleged abuse remains physical, followed by psychological. For persons aged over 65, the most significant categories of alleged abuse are psychological, physical, and financial. I know Gillian mentioned financial there a bit too. And alleged financial abuse and neglect increase with age, with the highest level of reporting in those over 80 years. And a lot of our referrals would be around financial abuse. So this brings me on to the coercive control element. And this is an offence that was only added to the domestic violence legislation in 2018. But again, only in the manner of it occurring in an intimate relationship, or that dynamic. Coercive control, we find, can often be overlooked by outside observers due to the fact that victims can sometimes be seen as colluding or consenting to the behaviour. Those exercising control may be viewed by outside observers as having what may be perceived as the best interests of the victim at heart, when in reality the situation may be quite the opposite. Just one example that we had in recent times, I suppose, within SAGE, was we had a gentleman who was living with MS and his wife was caring for him. There were huge elements of control within the relationship perpetrated by the wife, mainly due to her wanting to protect. It was a completely risk averse, wanting to protect in case, any kind of harm could come to her husband. And I suppose in turn, how we viewed it was that it was removing all of the gentleman's independence and choice, and completely limiting abilities which he still had, just for fear of something happening to him. When he moved into a nursing home setting, that the relationship was, I suppose, of trying to control, what he did and where he went and how much he did in the day, it was also being controlled by the wife via the management in the nursing home. And this was all in a bid to protect the gentleman, but indirectly was creating a dynamic of abuse. So I suppose coercive control is often perceived as that which is only found in romantic relationships or peer relationships. However, we frequently receive referrals and concerns where there's a dynamic and element of coercive control between siblings, and the vulnerable older person being caught in the fire line. And sometimes it's whereby siblings or children believe that they know and they decide how the older person should spend one's own money, for example. Or if it comes down to maybe a fair deal application, the nursing home support scheme loan, and there's an agenda there around inheritance, or, the siblings think, well, we don't want mom or dad to put a charge on the house for the fair deal because it may affect our inheritance in the long run. And this in itself is abuse. This is a coercive control, a power dynamic whereby somebody's trying to control somebody's decision or somebody's choices to benefit themselves. Does that make sense? Yeah. Sorry, I have notes here beside me. I hope that's okay because I'm reading over them back. So I also felt some of the Safeguarding Ireland awareness research findings that this is between 2017 and 2021 are also relevant. The Irish public believes that abuse of vulnerable adults is widespread. Certainly in SAGE, we would share that feeling. 50% say that they have experienced the abuse of vulnerable adults either through being abused themselves or seeing somebody else close to them being abused. Almost 1 in 4 do not know who to report adult abuse to. Safeguarding Ireland states that tougher laws would encourage more people to call out abuse of vulnerable adults. Public seeks a dedicated 24-hour helpline for adult abuse. That's what the public were looking for through the Safeguarding Ireland's report. 91% supported stronger laws to safeguard people from abuse or neglect, and 85% of the public support establishing a national authority for safeguarding. Again, SAGE's experience, I suppose, of the reporting of abuse. Often we feel that the reporting of abuse may not reflect the true nature and extent of abuse due to sometimes a fear on the part of the victim of the consequences which may follow. Again, putting the emphasis on being placed in a nursing home, because this is something we hear a lot. Being told that they will have no access to their own money, lack of reporting down to a lack of awareness what their experience is actual abuse. So maybe they've lived with this throughout their lives. Maybe it's a kind of a cultural thing where they feel like, is this or isn't this abuse? I didn't even know it was when it might be raised. A lack of clarity as to whom they should report abuse to, a lack of capacity to understand and report, limited verbal and other communication skills, maybe due to a stroke, maybe due to progressing dementia, fear of upsetting relationships. Sometimes that's a vulnerable person, older person in a nursing home that don't want to rock the boat with staff or nursing home management, and they think, oh, look, I don't want to, to voice something here. And sometimes, again, more than a nursing home or more than in someone's own home, what will the consequences be if I say something? Will my carer come back in the morning to get me out of bed? Or when they do come back, am I going to face the consequences of having reported? It leaves people in a massively vulnerable position. Like, there is no safeguard there that somebody feels, if I report this, it will have no consequences to me being in receipt of my care. Often shame and embarrassment and a culture and a religion often impacts on perspectives of abuse, its recognition and reporting. I'm also mentioning capacity here, and I know Gillian spoke about capacity a good bit as well, or I mentioned it above, the capacity or sometimes the lack of capacity. A vulnerable person may have a diagnosis of dementia or may have one or other condition where the capacity is affected. So perhaps we call it fluctuating capacity. So on a good day, Mary might say, oh, I want to seek out help with regards to disclosing of the abuse. You go and meet them, you'll sit down, and she might just tell everything that has been going on, and then you could go back the next day and the capacity may not be at the same place, and it might either be, the information might be either denied that was given the day before, or it could be withdrawn or whatever. So capacity is a huge element in this. And we see that a lot as well, maybe in nursing homes where there might be an abusive situation. We'll just say, for example, between two residents, even if they both had dementia or one had dementia, and if the guards were called in, there would always be an emphasis put on, oh, we need to get a capacity assessment first. I'll speak about that further on as well with regards to the new legislation. I just thought this visual was quite good in terms of, to me, it depicts the root of some of these feelings. Really, is walking on eggshells. The vulnerable person, the reluctance to speak up when you're in a vulnerable position, and it often stems, we feel, from a paternalistic culture or mindset. The vulnerable person being told or feeling that decisions or behaviours emanate from a good place, or knowing what's best, or having the person's best interests at heart. And oftentimes it's agencies or services or people being risk averse. When in truth, often this mindset and culture is completely impinging on the rights of the human rights of a person. This is a culture and a societal view that needs to change. And we certainly hope, well, I hold strong hopes that when the assisted decision-making legislation does come into effect in June, so be it, that there will be a huge emphasis placed on supporting a person to make a decision rather than focusing on capacity, but looking at where is the person at now And despite where the capacity is at, how can we support them to make a decision? And how can we support them with choices that they have to make? So capacity won't be such an issue, I would hope, going forward. Like, even in terms of that example I said about liaising with the Gardaí, that we, even now as an organisation, we always presume capacity. If we get a referral for a vulnerable person, we'll just say in an abusive situation and we're told the person doesn't have capacity, we go out and meet them on the basis that we are presuming capacity. And once the legislation is in effect, there'll be an onus on everyone to do that. Just thought it was also relevant just to add in a couple of little points about the impact of COVID-19, particularly from a SAGE perspective. In terms of the older person, it makes a point there, the human rights of older people. There was little or no older voices being elicited regarding the restriction policies during COVID-19. And our helpline was hopping really during the whole pandemic, and not only from clients or vulnerable people in nursing homes, but family members, you know, that were hugely being impacted, and were the voice for the people within the nursing home saying, like, mum is in there 2 months or 3 months now, she hasn't seen anyone, her dementia is progressing, like, you know. And I suppose there was very little consultation with the people themselves, the people, and is that a form of abuse? I suppose, you know, that's open to I'll leave it there, I suppose. But public health guidelines also demonstrate an increase in family violence. There was an increase to helplines around incidents of abuse perpetration, intimate partner violence being termed a pandemic within a pandemic. Public health measures have exacerbated risk and increased potential for coercive control. And again, I suppose, you know, when there was a situation in a home where somebody may have contracted COVID, or a carer may have contracted COVID and couldn't go into it to provide care for somebody, that person was left even more isolated. You know, so now they were relying on people that may not have their best interests at heart, we'll just say. So COVID had a lot to answer for, as we all know. And just to give you two examples, and this is kind of leading on to finish up, but coercive control and abuse. Mary spent 6 weeks, and obviously all the names are anonymous, they're all changed. Mary spent 6 weeks in an acute hospital setting after a fall at home. This will be very, as well, typical of maybe one of our referrals. Her family encouraged her to go to a local nursing home for convalescence, and without Mary's knowledge or consent, Mary's family had arranged with the nursing home for her to remain there long term. After 2 months, Mary's family refused to discuss her return home with her and continually told her to wait another while. Mary's neighbour informed her that her son had changed her locks to her house, again without her knowledge or consent, and he had also set up a direct debit to pay the nursing home using her bank account without her knowledge and consent. The nursing home contacted SAGE as they were concerned that Mary's in the nursing home against her express wishes, and SAGE became involved, and our role was to support Mary to assert her right to make her own decisions, have her voice heard, and make a planned discharge home. And yet that will be a very typical referral for us. But coming from the perspective of the family there, for example, it would often be a case of, but she can't manage at home. We know this is the best place for her, you know, and no idea that the impingement on someone's right to be involved in the decision even is wrong. You know, that sometimes doesn't even enter someone's mindset. So sometimes it's an ignorance or a lack of knowledge around what determines abuse. And the second example was Michael is a long stay resident of a private nursing home, single man, some family contact and involvement. His limited mobility requires assistance with personal care and a history of mental health difficulties and a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment. At times, Michael and his behaviour is a challenge, includes shouting, threatening staff and visitors, and he's been named as the person causing concern when safeguarding screenings of other residents took place. Many complaints regarding Michael's behaviour have been received by the Director of Nursing from other residents' family members. He has physically assaulted another male resident after he entered his room without permission and was asked to leave, and more recently alleged to have sexually assaulted a female resident, some parts of which were captured on CCTV. Gardaí requested a capacity assessment be carried out prior to meeting with Michael. And I suppose often when referrals such as this come in, it highlights you know, the lack of protective measures for individuals in residential settings. Liaising with the Gardaí, and I mentioned this already, can at times be challenging because the issue of capacity arises and the need to have a capacity assessment completed, not working from the basis of presumption of capacity. Also, these situations of peer abuse are not covered under the Domestic Violence Legislation 2018, which adds to the complexity. So, for example, the perpetrator may have a diagnosed dementia, may be unaware of his behaviours, or have, there may not be an intent there. On the other hand, the perpetrator may have arrived to the nursing home having a history of abusing, being a perpetrator, and now has dementia. And I suppose I don't have the answers or the solutions to any of this, but I felt the need to highlight the complexity of the situation and the complexity of abuse within that older person realm and the environments. And I do, again, I suppose, just to emphasise, the supported decision-making legislation will provide services within a framework which we feel will be more equipped to deal with situations taking into account the human rights of all the individuals involved. And then our recommendations from the SAGE perspective. So as an organisation whose greatest percentage of referrals is the older population over 65s, we feel that there should be stronger law enforcement and preventative measures. There's a clear need for stronger law enforcement in respect to abuse of and violence against adults at risk. Proactive targeting and prosecution of people who abuse vulnerable adults needs to be promoted by Garda Síochána. Abuse in residential care facilities, then dealing with this abuse presents significant challenges for society as a whole. However, there is scope for a much more proactive approach in respect of, for example, highlighting the potential criminal aspect of much of this abuse and publicising the fact that it's a policing issue and Gardaí are available to help bring the perpetrators to justice. Information sharing, then, I suppose, a clear need to prioritise safeguarding of vulnerable adults in the context of information sharing and collaborative working between the various stakeholders. Human rights awareness, safeguarding adults who are at risk of abuse and exploitation is an integral part of implementing a human rights approach, and awareness of us all to be involved to be cognizant of the provisions of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Assisted Making Capacity Act or legislation 2015. So to conclude, I suppose just that all of us have a role to play. It's essential that service providers highlight concerns as they arise and seek support from the relevant authorities. There are large gaps in legislation, practices, systems and organisations that are very costly on individual lives and do not respect the dignity of each person as an individual within his or her own rights, her own rights. And I suppose the abuse we can see from even, Gillian's presentation to mine, and you had 3 other weeks of it, I think. Abuse takes many forms and disguises, and the conversation around it needs to broaden. Support and collaboration is necessary, challenging and changing this culture both within institutions and across society as a whole. The voices of vulnerable adults who have been victims of abuse or who live in potentially abusive situations need to be fully heard, and that's the empowerment approach, our central engagement of all sectors. And we need to acknowledge subjectivity depending on culture, religion. And I just want to thank Claire Haven for the opportunity to present. And I know Gillian said at the start of hers that she talks fast. I'd say I, definitely ran a mile ahead for there. So I'm sorry if I went through too quickly, and I hope it was okay. But yeah, and again, just to point out, I suppose that where abuse, comes into it, it doesn't discriminate even where age applies.
No, just to comment on what she said, like obviously there's big overlaps between disability and age-related disability and stuff like that, but around the being recipients of charity rather than equal rights holders. And we have a history in Ireland of the charity model, the deficit model, the medicalised model, and seeing people who are older or who are disabled, people who have additional vulnerabilities, as being recipients of charity rather than rights holders within their own right. And I think that's where we need to, where as a society we need to start changing and need to start realizing, as you said, presume competence. Go from a level of presuming competence, and it should influence across services, that anybody who comes through your door, you presume competence before you